I'm excited to welcome today Dr. Cody Sanders. Dr. Sanders is an ordained Baptist minister in the Alliance of Baptists and American Baptist Churches USA. And currently, he is teaching at Luther Seminary after serving at the old Cambridge Baptist Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he was also the chaplain to Harvard University and advisor for LGBTQ affairs at MIT. His current research interests have to do with building ministerial and congregational capacity to lead in cultivating caring communities amid climate collapse, political turmoil, technological acceleration, and the uncertainty of complex near-future scenarios for our life and world. It's just so exciting to have Dr. Sanders with us. I've known Cody for several years, and I find he has a kind and wise spirit, along with a courageous ability to speak the truth in ways that lead to wisdom. So I'm just overjoyed that you're here with us and that you're willing to talk to us about LGBTQIA belonging in our communities. Thank you, Cody.
Thanks so much. It's so good to be with you, and I was grateful for this invitation. One of my favorite things is joining with clergy and laity who are really interested in learning about cultivating belonging and well-being and justice for LGBTQIA people. And I'm very appreciative for your work, Phil, and for Austin Presbyterian Seminary and the commitment that you have to resourcing people for this work. And I appreciate being a part of it. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I approach this and give you some various areas that you might be interested in exploring in your own work of LGBTQIA, inclusivity, belonging, justice. I often like to start talks like this with a story, and it's a story that wherever I tell it, almost no one knows, including when I tell the story in the midst of LGBTQIA people and ministers. It's a story that has almost been lost to us, which in some ways is a form of epistemological violence in the way that our stories as LGBTQ people have been taken from us because they're not passed down to us. So I want to pass down this story of some of my queer and trans ancestors who are some of the reasons that I am here where I am today, teaching at Luther Seminary, an ordained Baptist minister. A small group of lesbian and gay members of a Catholic parish had confessed their same-sex relationships to their priest. They had done this in a way, however, not because they thought it was morally wrong for them to be in same-sex sexual relationships, but because they wanted their priest to know this important thing about their lives. The priest's pastoral response to this this part of his congregants' lives was that when the people who had shared their same-sex sexuality with the priest approached the altar rail every week for communion, when the priest got to that person, he would pass them over. And this happened again and again, and it was upsetting to the gay and lesbian members of this parish. It was upsetting to a lot of the straight members of this parish who caught on to what was going on. And every week they would come and they would stand at the altar and the priest would pass them over. So after a while, this group of gay and lesbian parishioners, along with some of their straight siblings, went down the road and rented space in a hotel lounge and began what was called the Eucharistic Catholic Church, named for the very element of their faith tradition that had been denied them because of their sexuality. And they practiced their faith together in this hotel lounge, founding this new expression of church, which became the very first church ever started by gay and lesbian people. And I often like to ask people when they thought this happened and where they think this might have happened. And typically the responses are something like, the late 1960s in some place like New York or San Francisco, or maybe the 80s in LA or someplace like that. The Eucharistic Catholic Church began in 1946 in Atlanta, Georgia, the heart of the American South. And what's even more remarkable is that this church was started with people who came from the Catholic tradition, as well as many Protestant traditions, and people who had no Christian tradition but wanted a place to belong. And in 1946, Atlanta, Georgia, the Eucharistic Catholic Church was a racially integrated congregation in Jim Crow South. It was led by a pastor named George Hyde, who had been born in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He grew up as a Southern Baptist minister before he moved to, or a Southern Baptist church before he moved to the Catholic faith. I think this story in particular is one of resilience in the face of spiritual forms of violence. It's a story that is a source of courage for LGBTQ people throughout the ages who have stood up to the authorities in their religious traditions, in their social settings, in the legal sphere, and have demanded a place at the table, a place of belonging, a place of inclusivity, a place of justice. And this group of LGBTQ and straight members of this Catholic parish exhibit this deep courage that grew out of their sense of faithfulness. I mean, I think that's an important thing for us to note about this story. They did not leave their Christian tradition. They left the church that said that they could not belong, and they founded a new expression of following in the ways of Jesus. And it's a story of great beauty and joy. People who came together to practice their faith, to share community with one another, to form what literally would become, in many instances, life-saving expressions of community at the margins of their ecclesial and communal and familial status quos. I start this webinar with that story, because many of our stories about what it means to be affirming of LGBTQIA people are come out of a place of struggle and pain, stories of rejection, stories of violence, stories of churches needing to be attentive to the needs of LGBTQ people. And all of those things are really helpful and legitimate and true. As a professor of pastoral care, I teach a lot about those concerns. But our lives are not totalized by these stories of problems that we've faced. Our queer and trans lives are also full of stories of joy and resilience and courage and faithfulness and love. And these stories need to be told. I don't have a real way of gauging this in this setting, but I would imagine that out of the, almost 40 or so of you here, that not more than one or two of you have ever heard that story before. That would be typical of the audiences that I have for talks like this. Most of the time, nobody has, but I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt. A couple of you may have heard that story before, but there is a problem in the fact that we haven't heard this story. A story of a gay and lesbian congregation starting before the gay and lesbian rights movements organizations like the Mattachine Society were ever even founded. Mattachine Society was founded in Los Angeles in 1950. The first expression of organizing around LGBTQ inclusivity and justice was the Eucharistic Catholic Church. And then many years later, the largest grassroots organization of LGBTQ people in the world was the MCC Church, the Metropolitan Community Church. The first building ever owned by LGBTQIA organizers was not a political organizing space or a community center. It was a church, the MCC Church. So whatever church you're in, whatever tradition you come from, whatever perspective you currently hold on LGBTQ inclusivity and justice in your theological tradition, there are queer and trans people in your church, in your denomination, in this larger movement caught up in the ways of Jesus. And we are intentionally and critically and with great joy practicing our faith, even if you haven't noticed it. But one thing that you could do as ministers, people who are charged with caring for the stories of the tradition of your church that would increase the sense of belonging for LGBTQ people, even if you're already affirming, one thing you can do is include stories like this in stories of radical faithfulness. When you tell stories of faithfulness from the pulpit, queer and trans people should be showing up in those stories, because there are queer and trans people in your congregation who, when they hear those stories, suddenly see themselves belonging to the tradition for the first time. Even if they've belonged to your church, they may not have a way of imagining the ways that they have belonged to the tradition that you belong to prior to showing up at your church. And this story is just one among many stories of queer and trans faithfulness. And in fact, I'll put a link that you can go to find that story in the chat. I first heard the story from a queer religious historian, Heather Rachel White, who has a great academic article about this that I'm also glad to get to you if you'd like later. I don't have a link to that one though. But one of the ways that this story points us in a new direction when we think about queer and trans inclusivity, justice, and belonging is a needed shift from postures of hospitality to postures of belonging. Another way to think about that is a shift from what we have done for a long time, figuring out how to be welcoming and affirming of LGBTQ people in our churches, and then shifting the energy of that welcome and affirmation into something that looks more like celebrating LGBTQIA lives. So first, along that trajectory of moving from hospitality to belonging, welcoming and affirming to celebrating, is really doing a good job at critically assessing whether we are actually doing hospitality well. The first part of that trajectory. What are the outward signs of your affirming commitments to LGBTQ people in your community? Some of the things that I just want to name as being important for you to think about is the way we language that commitment. A lot of churches do a lot of really hard work to figure out how to be affirming as a church to LGBTQ people. Sometimes you lose folks along the way. Many times you gain folks along the way. Sometimes there's pain and struggle toward that affirmation. But the saddest thing that I see in that work is that when churches have done this long, deliberative, prayerful, faithful work to become affirming of LGBTQ people, then they don't tell anybody about it. Or they tell people about it in ways that nobody can recognize. Some examples: Baptists use the term welcoming and affirming. Presbyterians, more light. Methodists, Lutherans, reconciling. UCC, open and affirming. And I'm going to tell you something that is true right now that I need you to hear. Nobody outside of your tradition knows what any of those things mean. My partner and I, my partner left the Catholic Church when he was a teenager and has never really been a part of a church since. He and I were driving around in Maine one day and saw a church that said open and affirming on the side. There were no pride flags, nothing like that, just the words open and affirming. And I asked if he knew what that meant, and he said he assumed it meant the church thought of itself as a very welcoming place. And I said, well, would you imagine that it had anything to do with LGBTQ welcome? And he said, no, why would I ever think that? So you may think that when you have done this work and put the words welcoming, affirming, or more light, or reconciling on your sign, that you are signaling to your community that LGBTQ people can find a place of belonging here. But you have not done that work adequately because people don't know what those words mean. Find ways of expressing LGBTQ affirmation on your sign with visible signals like pride and trans flags and things like that. And I can tell you from my experience in the parish that when my congregation in Cambridge started putting signs of not only of our LGBTQ affirmation, but of many other forms of justice that we were committed to, people started coming to the church because they saw those outward signs of what this congregation stood for, what kind of community we were building. And very interestingly, gay and lesbian people certainly showed up, but I think the majority of people who showed up because they saw a rainbow flag or the LGBTQ affirmation signals outside were straight and cisgender people, because they said, I can't go to a church where my brother, my cousin, my friend, my classmate can't belong. So when I saw the rainbow flag, I knew that I needed to come to this church. So please be diligent in the very simple acts of hospitality, of inviting people in to see what's going on in your congregation. The next thing I wanted to highlight, though, is this movement that very few churches ever take from questions of 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 belongingness, like who can belong in our structures of community, who can be baptized, who can be married here, who can be ordained. A lot of our congregations and denominations have undertaken that kind of work. And for that work, we ask questions of suspicious scrutiny. Who can belong? And many congregations have followed those questions to places of greater affirmation, greater belonging, and that's a really good thing. But at the end of that, once you decide we're an affirming congregation, a lot of churches think that that's the end, that that's the work that they have done, and they are finished with it now. But there's a next step to that that is the most life-giving step on the trajectory of moving from hospitality to belonging, and that is shifting our questions toward questions of compassionate curiosity. Those questions don't ask who can belong in our structures of membership and baptism and ordination and all that kind of stuff. Compassionate curiosity asks, what can we learn from the lives and experiences of LGBTQIA people that would benefit the entire church? What can we learn about love and relationship from LGBTQ people who have been practicing committed relationships at the margins of their churches, at the margins of their family, at the margins of the legal structures for generations? What can we learn about practices of community building from queer and trans people who have had to create the communities that they needed in order to simply survive some of the worst times in our history of LGBTQ violence, of the AIDS crisis when the government wanted queer people dead? Communities formed to keep people alive. What can we learn about practices of faithfulness when the numbers of congregational membership is in decline and LGBTQ people have been diligently working since 1946 and beyond to belong to churches? What can we learn about practices of forgiveness from LGBTQIA Christians who know the harm that has been perpetrated and yet are still willing, interested, even eager to belong to our faith traditions and our congregations? Once you start asking those questions, what you're asking is how LGBTQIA lives are going to enrich the entirety of the congregation. Not just can an LGBTQIA person be comfortable sitting beside you in the pew or preach from the pulpit, but how is our collective life going to change because these queer and trans siblings are now fully a part of our collective journey? Those are some really exciting questions that then get you into some creative expressions of resilience and courage and faithfulness and beauty and joy that queer and trans people have known for a long time, but the rest of you haven't seen because you haven't asked the questions of compassionate curiosity about our lives and experiences. The next thing I just want to highlight is asking in your congregation and the communities that you serve, what is unique about your community that would help you live out your welcoming commitments in a tangible way? I often consult with churches that have been welcoming and affirming for a really long time, but they're asking 10, 20, even 30 years into that commitment, what does that mean for us anymore? We have lots of LGBTQ people here. We've been a place of belonging for a really long time, but we know that we're not done with this journey. There's certainly always things to learn about LGBTQIA lives and expressions, and you can tell that there's something to learn when you hear the acronym LGBTQIA2S+, et cetera, growing and growing, because more and more of us are being able to name our experiences of gender and sexuality on our own terms in ways that are true to our own embodied experience for the first time, rather than to have those named for us. And I know that that growing acronym and glossary of terms is really confusing and really hard to hold in your head, and that's okay. It can be confusing and frustrating as long as you are gracious enough to recognize that it's a sign of liberation. that people are being able to name their experiences for themselves. So there are things that our churches need to continue learning about trans and genderqueer people, about asexuality, about gender fluidity, all sorts of things that many churches that became welcoming and affirming 15 years ago never thought about because no one was talking about them in ways that those churches overheard. But beyond that, some of the most interesting expressions of new commitments of affirmation have come when I talk to churches that start to tie their historic narratives of commitments to, for example, economic justice, to the prevalence of LGBTQ youth homelessness in their cities. About 28% of LGBTQ youth experience homelessness or some sort of precarity in their living situation at some point. So it's a major issue, especially in big cities. And when churches start to realize that they have a lot of skill and facility and a history with economic justice issues and homelessness, and they have a commitment to LGBTQ inclusivity and justice, they can put those things together and figure out how to intervene in contexts of LGBTQ youth homelessness in their cities, in cities where that doesn't yet exist. Now, in some cities, you'll find that there are already shelters and things of this nature that have a particular emphasis on LGBTQ inclusivity and justice. And in those situations, you can partner with those organizations. But in many cities, churches that I've spoken to, they do that investigation and they find that there's nothing in their city. And that church starts to think about the other 4 or 5 churches in town that are big, kind of resourceful churches that all know how to do really creative things, but they've never thought to put these commitments of economic justice and LGBTQ justice together before. And then you get really exciting things that grow out of it. But I know Baptist churches in the South that are hosting LGBTQ youth support groups that are led by straight ministers at their congregation. And LGBTQ people are coming because it's the only way that they can find that kind of supportive community in their town or city. And it's at their local affirming Baptist church. Another really great Baptist church that I've been following for a while that has space that they're not using in their church that they have given to the local LGBTQ youth service organization in their city. Churches that are beginning services of trans days of remembrance or pride celebrations and things like that, that are ways to invite people together for public expressions of solidarity and justice. I'll tell you one experience of my congregation in Cambridge. For many, my congregation has been affirming for about 40 years. And we had been a part of the Pride Parade for a really long time. And the Pride Parade's fun. You march with a bunch of people down the street and people are celebrating and they get to see a Baptist church and they're amazed that there's a Baptist congregation that's affirming. But for a couple of years, the Pride organization in Boston fell apart and they weren't having Pride. So we connected with a group called Youth Pride that did a Pride festival on the Rose Kennedy Greenway, where, 100 organizations or so would come and set up booths and tables and tents that had everything from, like health-related services to, local organizations that did various things with LGBTQ people. We were that year, about 2 years ago, the only church that I saw there, because most churches in our area did the regular Pride and not the Youth Pride. But we had signed up that year. We went, we set up our tent, we gave away tote bags for people to carry around all the swag that they picked up from the booths and things and candy and whatnot. And we talked to people when they would come to the table. On 2 different occasions that day, a mother approached the table in tears and said that she did not know until she saw our table that there were churches that she and her family could belong to where their child would not be exposed to what I would call spiritual violence. And this is in Boston, folks. A place where there are tons of LGBTQ affirming churches that maybe just aren't doing a very good job at signaling the fact that they're affirming. And for these 2 mothers who approached our table, both of them told stories of leaving their church when their child came out as queer or trans, because they knew that their church would not be a place that their child would be treated well. And neither of them knew that there was a place that they could go and belong as a family to a community that would affirm their child's gender or sexuality. And countless youth throughout the day would stop and be kind of stunned in front of our booth and say, wow, I can't believe there's a Baptist church here. Or actually, they just said that, I can't believe there's a church here, because they had not seen that at Youth Pride before. And even though they weren't folks who, were necessarily going to come to our church, many of them lived in other parts of Massachusetts, countless youth said, thank you for being here. It means so much to see a church expressing solidarity and belonging for LGBTQ people. It was a really incredibly moving experience for the folks who worked the booth that day, and one that completely surprised me because it was such an intimate connection that we could make with that booth, unlike, marching through the crowded streets in a pride parade. Find opportunities like that. Don't push yourselves on people. Don't be desperate for people to come to your church. Just put yourself in places where LGBTQ people are living their lives, celebrating their loves and their embodiments, and message your own commitments to loving and coming alongside them in movements of justice. We're getting to the end of the time that I want to be monologuing, because I want to involve some of you in conversation. But a couple of things that I just want to note here as we move forward. There are many ways of attending to the wounds, spiritual and otherwise, that LGBTQ youth in particular face. I'm going to put some links in the chat for ways that you can find out more about what some of these are. For example, I mentioned LGBTQ youth homelessness, which is about 28% of LGBTQ youth who experience some form of that, adverse school experiences, interpersonal violence, suicide, which is about 4 times more likely for LGBTQ youth than it is for straight and cisgender youth. So here are a lot of links for you to learn more about those things. You can copy this and then and keep those. There's also 2 books at the end, one by Brooke Peterson, which is a terrific book on the ways LGBTQ people have experienced trauma in their churches and then have returned to those, not the same churches, but have returned to churches, and the ways churches can form caring ministry around those traumas and harms, and then a book that I wrote on suicide as well. The other thing I want to mention before we move into questions is for you to be really attentive to the fact that LGBTQ people who show up in your churches are not synonymous with the wounds that they have experienced. We are not our wounds, though we have often experienced wounds within Christian communities. So be attentive to the propensity for Christian communities to have wounded LGBTQ people in the past, but also be really curious about the expressions of faith that LGBTQ people are living out. I'll tell one last story of a man I interviewed for my book on suicide, who had had a suicide attempt in his 20s, survived, left the church, and then I interviewed him when he was about 50. So he'd been out of the church for about 30 years. The reason he had been out of the church for 30 years is because that entire time he did not know there were any churches he could belong to. And he was in a pretty major city. For our interview, we were sitting within a couple of miles of probably half a dozen affirming churches, and he had passed by them so many times that he had never seen anything on those churches' signs that indicated that he could belong there. At the end of our interview, he had such beautiful, sophisticated, complex ways of describing his faith that I said, Thomas, it sounds like you've read a lot of queer theology. And Thomas said, what is queer theology? All of the work that he had done, all of the beauty and complexity and intricacy of his faith expression had happened in solitude, because he did not know that there were communities that he could come alongside and grow in those faith expressions. And he had done incredibly creative and beautiful work at the margins of Christian traditions that churches should be attending to, because they're examples of faithfulness. So I want just to encourage you to look at LGBTQ lives, not just as lives that have been lived in, in oftentimes at the pain and violence that churches have inflicted on us, but also lives that have been lived in faithfulness and joy and beauty, and to lean into the possibilities of celebrating queer and trans lives, not just affirming them. Why don't we move into some questions?
Well, I'll just say this. I've noticed a tendency in your work to kind of foreground LGBTQ folks as leaders and theologians. Like your youth ministry book really talks about putting LGBTQ teens in leadership positions. And then in your book on suicide, you really listen to stories and and hear those stories as theological. I was wondering, in what ways does it transform communities to have LGBTQ lives and stories be leaders and the centers of theological reflection, sources of theological reflection? I think I might just start with that question. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, in any community where there are certain embodiments of human difference, whether those be racial or gender or sexual or national or otherwise, being able to attend really carefully and with compassion and curiosity to the voices of people with different embodiments from the dominant norm of that congregation allows the congregation to listen in to conversations that they would not otherwise have heard, conversations about what it means to live life within the realm of God, as Jesus would have put it, and in those marginal spaces, even though the margins have been created out of structures of injustice and exclusion, and there's no sense in valorizing marginalization. But in those marginal spaces that we found ourselves in over the course of time because of our race or gender or sexuality or class or nationality or whatever, the imagination, the theological imagination, can flourish in ways outside the dictates of the status quo that often restrict our vision to one particular way of thinking about our bodies or our relationships to God. So, you find this when you read queer theology, and you'll find this when you read Black liberation theology and womanist theology. You'll find yourself caught up in imagination that you didn't know was possible because you had never been invited to ask those kinds of questions due to your dominant position, racially or gender or sexually or otherwise. So I think that the fullness of our lives lived within the realm of God cannot really be reached or expressed without attending to voices that we would not otherwise be attending to if we weren't really careful to access this creativity that exists outside the restricting dictates of the status quo. And it does change us. It enriches our lives. It helps us to live into our relationships with the divine more fully. And it's beautiful. I think that's both very difficult and really incredible because there are very few places in our increasingly polarized society where people across many different types of diversity, especially theological, ideological diversity, gather together anymore to do community with one another. And so you are the curator of one of those expressions of community in a cultural and social and political context that desperately needs that kind of community. I think a couple of things come to mind as helpful generally, and I'd be glad to connect later to see if I could be helpful more specifically in your context. But the two things that come to mind in hearing your story, one is to mind the narrative resources of your community, to do the really careful work of figuring out how your community became so diverse, became such a place where people across many different embodiments of human difference show up, when it doesn't sound like this community made any pronounced profession that they were going to be, an LGBTQ affirming congregation or whatever other things that are showing up like that in your community. So I think doing that narrative work to ask, what were the if you think about your church's story as composed like a book, what are some of the titles of the chapters in your church's narrative that make the current expression of that congregation's life make sense as the narrative has unfolded? What particular stands did the church take to make it a place where LGBTQ people could belong, even if it wasn't the stance of becoming affirming, which it sounds like it wasn't, it hasn't officially made that pronouncement, but LGBTQ people are becoming members there, belonging there, finding it a place of acceptance and belonging and grace. I would be really curious just to look at the church's narrative to figure out what unique things happened to make it such a place. And then if you're going to start talking about those commitments in more kind of open forum type ways, I think it would be really helpful for you to have a conversation prior to that, probably a multiple kind of series of conversations prior to that, about your community's commitments related to how you treat one another and how you form community together. What are the absolute sort of principles that you will not let go of when you engage one another in conversation? Maybe it's things like we don't attack people, and we use names and expressions and pronouns of people as they desire them to be used. We tell one another when something has hurt us in a way that then we can have corrected in conversation rather than just sort of distancing ourselves from others. A lot of the kinds of norms that probably already exist in your community, but maybe need to be lifted up before you engage in some really hard conversations that clarify your commitments around some of these issues. So knowing your story and the historical narrative that has brought you to this place, and knowing what commitments that you are making to one another as members of this community would be two things that I think could be helpful there. Yeah, where you are in this journey. So I think if you're at the point of asking questions about like what the Bible says about X, Y, and Z things, some really helpful books in that genre are Matthew Vine's book, God and the Gay Christian, very biblically rooted, very accessible, very easy to read. He based a lot of his research on a book by a scholar named Browning called Gender, Sexuality, and Theology, I believe. It's a thicker book, a little more academic. Both of those are really good on the gay and lesbian kind of pieces. A terrific book on trans biblical thought and theology is Austin Hartke, who wrote a book called Transforming. Austin Hartke is also a graduate of Luther Seminary. Transforming is a beautiful book, and if your church hasn't delved into issues of like how you live out your affirmation for trans people, that's a great place to start. And another really helpful place to go is Justin Sabia-Tanis's book, Transgender. And I think the subtitle is like Theology, Ministry, and something else. Both of those really practical, very useful books for congregations. But then if you're looking at more like how do we live beyond the affirmation into learning from LGBTQIA lives, doing our theology from LGBTQIA perspectives and embodiments, I think one set of books that's really accessible for churches and beautifully written are Patrick Chang's series of books. There are 3 of them. One of them is called Rainbow Theology. One of them is called, oh man, I can't remember the other titles now. There's a series of 3 books, Patrick Chang. And if you look up Rainbow Theology, you'll see the others that he wrote before, though. I think Rainbow Theology was the 3rd one. And Rainbow Theology engages the intersection of sexual embodiments and racial embodiments. So I really highly recommend that one in particular. Lots of other recommendations that I have that I'm glad for you to email me. You can find my email on the Luther site, or I'll put it in the chat. Another before I forget, though, Pamela Lightsey's book called Our Lives Matter. Our Lives Matter by Pamela Lightsey. It's a very, very short book, very readable. And again, it's doing queer theology from a womanist perspective, and it's very accessible for churches. You could do a reading group on that, and it's a beautiful book. Yeah, that's a great question. I'll name a couple things that come to mind that are related to your question and try to get into some helpful stuff there. One is that I think we need to be attentive to the fact that there are a lot of LGBTQ people who are coming to your church or parts of your denomination, and they don't want to be in the middle of LGBTQIA discussions and deliberations. They want a church to belong to. They don't want their lives to be in the spotlight. And that is totally understandable. Not every LGBTQ person has the sense of call to be, on display to their congregations. So it can be really helpful in those situations that allies are taking the initiative to have conversations and not relying on there always being an LGBTQ person to prompt it, especially. But I think the careful work that has to be done is to figure out who, even if they're not in your congregation, who among LGBTQIA religious leaders in your denomination, in your city, in your region, do experience that call. It's what Peggy Campolo used to call your God duty, your gay on display duty. And that's the kind of thing I do with churches a lot. Churches that need a LGBTQIA person to come and talk about some of these issues with them. And I'm perfectly happy to do that because I find a lot of meaning and pleasure and joy in doing it. I feel it's a sense of my call to help churches do this work as an openly queer person, but not every queer person does. So doing the work to figure out who in your communities wants to be involved in that conversation and being sure that they're there at those tables when those conversations are done, even if you have to invite them and bring them in from outside because they're people and they are willing to do it. And if they're coming in from outside your community, I'd also say be really intentional about how you compensate them for the emotional labor, not just the intellectual labor, but the emotional labor of being on display and having a lot of questions that are probably not always very comfortable asked about them and about their lives. But there are a lot of people for whom that is a really pronounced sense of call, and they might be in your congregation. But if they're not, there are some around you, I know. I think the other piece of this is attending to how we ask questions about LGBTQIA lives. And this goes back to the distinction between suspicious scrutiny. Should LGBTQIA people be married? Can or LGBTIQ people be ordained? What does the Bible say about X, Y, and Z? Suspicious scrutiny versus compassionate curiosity. What is it like for LGBTQ people in our faith community when they discover that they can't be married in this church? What is it that LGBTQ people have learned about relationships that would actually inform our church's perspective about marriage and covenanted relationship? You see the difference between those questions and the energy that those questions direct toward LGBTQIA lives. One is about figuring out the answers about how we have lived and should we belong, etc. The other is about inviting our wisdom into the room, into the church, into the denomination, and seeing our lives as a sacred source of wisdom because we too have had relationships with the divine that have taught us and shaped us and formed us in ways that could benefit everyone, should you be compassionate and curious enough to lean in a little closer and ask those questions. The book that I wrote called Queer Lessons for Churches on the Straight and Narrow is all about making that shift in congregational life. I hope those are some helpful responses to that question. And I appreciate you asking it. It's a really important one. Yeah, that's a really great question. Well, I'll tell you, I grew up Southern Baptist. I, in college, started to realize I needed to figure out new places to belong, because that wasn't going to be where I was going to be able to find a denominational home forever. I moved into the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which had a little bit more of a moderate stance, which is a really uncomfortable place to be, because then there's no clarity on whether you can belong there or not. And then I discovered the Alliance of Baptists, and I went to my first Alliance meeting when I was in seminary, and I saw a room full of people that included LGBTQ people, men and women. Most of the people at this meeting, ministers in their congregations. And it was just a liberative space where I could breathe easily for the first time in my denominational explorations, a place where I no longer had to question whether or not I could belong here, and certainly didn't have to question whether the gifts that I brought would be embraced or not. I think finding ways to cultivate that kind of community in your area, especially if you are in an area where there just aren't a lot of opportunities like that, um, and where there aren't a lot of spaces for LGBTQIA clergy together. Forming communities in your local area, I think, is a really helpful one. And as straight or cisgender allies in this work, being sure that when you show up at denominational meetings and LGBTQIA issues are discussed, that you, as a straight or cisgender ally, are right there in that conversation, advocating for inclusivity and justice and belonging, and not leaving it up to the LGBTQIA people to have to come to their own denominational gathering and advocate for their embrace among their own people. I think it's always been a really incredibly heartening experience for me to see straight and cisgender people opening spaces of belonging and inclusivity and working toward justice, because they get it and they know it's important and they know it's a part of our sense of living into an identity that's shaped by the gospel. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, Dr. Sanders, that is really wonderful. I've been tasked with the really difficult job of closing this conversation up, I would say, just because of the richness of what you brought to us today, Dr. Sanders. I just really appreciate it. I have a feeling from our conversation, both of kind of a sense of like the hopefulness of a future where that really, like, belonging in a religious sense is life or death, right? It's very, very important for people to find a spiritual home and to find a place where they feel welcome and they're represented and their perspectives are included. And I also appreciate how you've opened directions, and your work does this for me so much, open new directions of things that I need to learn more about. And I think one of the things that your work gives us too is like a pastoral wisdom for conversations about LGBTQ identity are coming into your ministry already, and they're already there. And what can you do to kind of be prepared ahead of time? And a lot of your books point to this, like, how could you be resourced before having a conversation with a young person in your community or something like that, where you're going to be helping them think about the ethical communities that they're coming out to. As you have a critique of the word coming out as well that I really like, to Dr. Sanders. But with you, I'm kind of picturing a community that is alive with the gospel and is celebratory, not simply like scrutinizing to see like who's going to be inside and outside, and really a community that is listening to the witness of the Spirit that helps us to hear one another, even when we seem to be speaking different languages. And that, I think, is I think you've given us so many gifts today and so many directions forward. I'm really looking forward to digging into some of the resources that you've provided to us. And we're going to make this video that you've done available to people who registered. And then also the resources that you've recommended will make available as well on the website.
Perfect. Thank
It
you
has
so
just been wonderful to see you today, Dr.
Yeah,
Sanders. So,
it's
yeah.
good to see you too. I really appreciate this space and for all of you who've shown up here. I mean, it's a really hardening thing for me to see clergy and laity coming to a webinar to figure out how to be better at LGBTQIA belonging and celebrating our lives and our congregations. And I think you're right. It is a life-saving expression of our faith tradition. I know many stories where the church, contrary to all of the stories that we normally hear, the church has been the place that has sustained LGBTQ people in their ability to live in some really precarious circumstances in their cities and towns. So this is important work, and thank you for all being on this journey together.
Well, thank you for your openness and generosity with us in so many ways. You've just been a wonderful leader and presenter, and really generous with your resources and time. So thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Good to see everybody. Thanks for coming.